You are now listening to the Well Beauty Lab podcast, where we inspire you to cultivate a lifestyle that supports your well-being. I am your host and Chief Wellness Officer, Lakeisha Enswa. Let's get into it. Hey, y'all. Hey, welcome to another episode of the Well Beauty Lab podcast. I am your host and Chief Wellness Officer, Lakeisha Enswa, and we have an awesome show here for you today. Today, we're talking about something that I think a lot of us struggle with, but may not be aware of, and that is people pleasing. And I have with us Ms. Brea Johnson, who is a licensed professional counselor who specializes working with both children and adults with transitions in life, depression, anxiety, mood disorders, career development, self-esteem, anger management, among other things. But Brea is really going to help us understand why we tend to people please, what that stems from, and then some ways that we can start to identify it and work past that. But before we get into our conversation with Brea, it is time for our Live Well tip of the week. And that's what we have decided to call this segment of the show. And this week's tip is, you were not made to make other people happy. Now, I believe that we all have a purpose in life. We were put on this planet for a reason. However, I do not believe that that purpose was to make other people happy. Should we spread joy in the world? Absolutely. Should we help people when we can? Without a doubt. Should we love everyone around us? For sure. But happiness is something that is kind of unique, and where it comes from and how that looks for each person is really different. And when we start to try to make other people happy, we can really get into a habit of sacrificing ourselves and sacrificing our own needs to our own detriment. And so I think that when we talk about people pleasing and we talk about being considerate, there's a fine line between the two. And I think it's important for us to remember that while we can be considerate of others, we were not put here to make sure that other people are happy. So we got to make sure that whatever we do, we are also taking care of ourselves. So on that note, it is time for us to get into this conversation with Brea. Well, guys, it is time to get into today's conversation, and we have licensed professional counselor, Ms. Brea Johnson, here with us to talk about something that I think a lot of us suffer from, and that is people pleasing. So, Brea, thank you so much for joining me. How are you today?
I am doing really good. How are you doing?
I am doing well. Thank you so much. Before we get started, can you please tell everyone a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Okay, so I am Brea. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I am licensed in Texas, but also in Pennsylvania, because that is originally where I got my license. I work in private practice, group private practice right now, and I mainly work with young adults, kids, teens. I work with some older adults as well, but I do a lot with, as you just said, people pleasing and self-esteem, depression, anxiety, all those type of things. So that's me.
Awesome. Awesome. So let's talk about people pleasing. I think it's something that a lot of us struggle with. I think especially women, a lot of women struggle with. But can you help explain to us what that typically looks like for those who might not know that that's what they're doing?
Okay, so I'm going to start from the beginning. So people pleasing typically develops in childhood, right? So if you have like a codependent parent, meaning that if they're upset, they expect you to make them feel better. So they're always depending on you to kind of like, you know, appease their needs. If you have a really critical parent that's like, oh, you got an A-, oh, why didn't you get an A+? That makes you kind of like want to please them and want to make sure that they're okay. So those are two examples top of my head that I deal with my clients. That's how it's created. It's created in childhood though. Sometimes unbeknownst to parents, they're conditioning their kid to, you know, go out into the world and please other people. So yeah, that's where it starts.
So it starts in childhood. So these are things that as adults, when we start looking around and saying, okay, I don't want to do these things anymore. I don't want to, you know, set out, and I'm tired of trying to make everybody else happy. But these are things that we've been carrying with us for a long time. So since we've been carrying it with us for so long, how do we start to break out of that?
Well, first, you know, everything for me in my practice is awareness. Awareness is key. Okay. So what I do with my clients is I'm like, okay, let's first figure out like where it's coming from before I just tell you the tools to how to get rid of it, right? You have to understand your why as to why you're doing certain things. So again, if you had that critical parent, we got to kind of talk about how that made you feel, how it made you feel about yourself. Because you have a critical parent, you kind of feel like if I don't give to someone, then I'm not worthy or I'm not enough. right? So if you don't really work through those kinks, you're not going to really be able to do the things that I'm trying to get you to do if you don't understand like the wound that's there for you.
Got it. So this is really some things that's going to require a lot of internal work, a lot of reflective work is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. And my clients don't like it. You know, it's painful. It's painful, but it's so worth it to really understand yourself.
Yeah, I can see where the difficulty comes in, especially if, you know, you're talking about things that happen in childhood. A lot of us don't like to look at our parents critically, especially if we had a otherwise, I guess, what some would call normal or good childhood, because those things can exist even what from the outside would look like a good childhood, correct?
Yeah, and I think people don't understand that, like, when we talk about trauma, like, there's little t and there's big T, right? So little trauma can be interpersonal things. That could be having a critical parent. I think people struggle with that because they're like, well, they raised me, they fed me, they did all the best they could, and that's fine. You can love your parent and not like something that they did that affected you negatively. We can do both. We don't have to just, we're not here to bash your parent, but we are here to say like, hey, when they did that, it affected me negatively. And I can't keep carrying that just because they provided me shelter and I should be grateful, right? People get caught up in that loop.
Yes. I think we do. We say, well, you know, I wasn't hit. I wasn't, physically abused. You know, I was well taken care of. And so do I really want to look at those things in a negative light? But I think you're right. Sometimes we just decide to hold on to it. What it sounds like is that those are things that we're going to have to face head on in order to move forward. So now that we're adults, right? And now we're creating the next generation. How do we keep from creating those same cycles? Like, how do we not be the critical parent? Because a lot of, especially in parenting, we do what we know or we do what we saw. And so how do we not, continue those things that subconsciously we don't necessarily see as wrong, but could be harming our children?
I think it's really important. Like when I have clients that are pregnant or that want children, we talk about those conversations. Like what from your childhood did you not get that you feel like you want to provide to your kids? So if that's like, I had a really critical parent, let's talk about what it looks like to not be critical. So that might be like really focusing on like affirming them, building their self-esteem, helping them cultivate like hobbies, things outside of themselves. Because when you're a people pleaser, typically you don't really have your own identity. Your identity is about like pleasing other people and like being overly considerate and overly like, oh, I'll help you. Oh, I'll do this. You know what I mean? So I think with parents, what I try to do is I try to help them identify like, okay, what's that sound like? What's that look like? I know it can be an annoying conversation for them to have sometimes, but it's like, okay, what's that look like if you're trying to cultivate self-esteem in your child? So that's like not yelling. If they get an F on something, okay, we can identify you could do better. But let's not say like you're dumb or name call. Let's say, okay, how can I help you? What are the tools you need so that I can do this with you versus just putting pressure on you to be perfect? Because no kid is perfect.
Right, exactly. I know as a parent, that's a struggle as you try to balance what you know and what you saw as a child versus trying to, do better or do differently for your own children. So I can imagine that being a difficult conversation for some people. So as we talk about, you mentioned being overly considerate. Is there a happy medium? Like, obviously, we want to be considerate of the people around us and other people's feelings. But where is that line between I'm being a generally considerate person and now I'm kind of sacrificing myself in consideration for someone else?
So I try to give my clients examples, like if you have a conflicting thing and they want you something at 2:30 and you have something to do at 2 and it's going to be really hard for you to make that, but you can do it, but it'd be really hard. Not voicing that. Be like, oh, I can do it. It's fine. Oh, it's fine. I'll just figure it out. Like not really being able to speak on what works for you and what doesn't. I think compromise is really useful, but you don't have to be overly considerate of other people's time. When you also have a life, you also have things you're trying to do. So just ensuring that, you're not overly apologetic. Like a dumb example I usually use is like the person that if they like bump into you or they you drop the pencil by your foot, like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Like they just get really, really, really anxious because they're feeling like, oh gosh, I displeased you. I'm doing something that you don't like, possibly, So typically me, those examples are what I use. I start small and then try to go bigger into like their lives of what they're actually doing.
Got it. So these are things that it sounds like being able to say, yes, I can do this for you, but it's going to be difficult for me, or it's going to be a sacrifice for me, or I'm going to need you to bend a little on some expectations. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Or being like, that doesn't work for me. Sometimes saying no is really important with the people pleaser, because that is the number one thing they will not do. They'll say, maybe, okay, kind of, like, no, it means no. We're not going to slice it. No means no.
That is something that I am working on. I am that person who's like, well, maybe let me think about it. Let me get back to you, instead of just saying no. No is a hard sentence for me to say. So I can totally understand. I see why it would be important, but I can totally understand why that is difficult for a lot of people. So, and, you talked about working with teenagers, and I know that is a difficult age because there's a lot going on with teenagers. So as a mom of a girl, I have 3 girls and one who is almost 9. So we're getting closer to those teenage years. Are there things that we can look for that can kind of give us insight into, okay, these are some habits that we might want to work on? It looks like that my child is kind of leaning into that people pleasing and we need to pull back. Like, are there some things that we can look at and kind of identify that in our children?
I think so. I think more so like if you're noticing like their friend group and they're always the one that's like being made fun of and kind of like they laugh it off. They're kind of just not standing up for themselves. People that are people pleasers, sometimes they don't stand up for themselves because they're kind of like they have to take things. Or if I'm assertive towards you, like you're going to be upset with me, right? I would say if you feel like your child, not you in particular, obviously, but if you kind of feel like your child in general doesn't really have like a sense of self, which 9-year-olds don't, right? But they're developing. Right. They're developing that. So you're looking for them to like have their own hobbies, their own things, not always just doing it because like a friend is doing it. It'll make them look cool. Like, they're in that age, but I do think there are conversations you can have with your kid to kind of help them understand, like, you can do that with them, but you also can like cultivate your own things and be your own person. So I really think it's just about like checking in with your kid and having those conversations, because kids are really impressionable. And if you don't have a conversation, they're going to go ask their 9-year-old friends and their friends know. You know what I mean? I remember asking my 16-year-old friends like about dating, and it's like, what do you know about dating? And why am I asking you? Like,
exactly, the blind leading the blind here. Nobody knows what they're talking about. So at what point do we seek professional help, both as a parent with their child and as an adult? Like, at what point is it like, okay, I need to go and seek professional help for this?
I would say I'm really a big advocate for there has to be nothing wrong. I feel like sometimes it's really just important to just kind of reflect in your life as an adult and just kind of see like what's there. If I had to give examples, I would say like as a child, if you feel like your kid's really depressed, they're not interacting with other people, or you feel like they are experiencing like engaging in self-harm, or they're really like closed off and not really talking about their feelings, but they seem like they're sleeping too much, or they're binging, or they're just having like really negative behaviors that you need them to talk to someone else. Because some kids don't feel comfortable talking to their parent, and that's okay. Right. So talking to a professional, I would say those are some of the signs that when my kids come in, that's what their parents are seeing. Like being closed off, not being social, sleeping too much, self-harm, saying they want to like kill themselves, things like that. When you're an adult, I think when it starts impeding like who you are as a person and you feel like you don't know who you are, it's time to come in to kind of talk to someone to see like what behavior or what's happening to where like you're cycling the same behaviors that could possibly be negative for you.
Okay, so with our kids, we're looking at kind of changes in behavior, things that could be alarming. And then as adults, we're looking at where we're kind of losing our sense of self, our sense of identity.
Yeah, definitely. I think with adults, it's a little bit more internal. And with kids, like, we're watching them. They're our responsibility. Right. So we're looking for like their external behaviors, because that's the only way we're going to know if they're not talking. Right.
Right. So as an adult, so let's say I'm an adult and I'm a huge advocate of therapy. It's something that I say in life and on the show a lot, telling people just go talk to somebody, go find a professional. But for those who are hesitant, because I know a lot of people who are like, I don't really need a professional. And it's like, but maybe you do. How do we, as the people around them, as their friends, as their loved ones, really encourage them to seek that professional help, or kind of, I guess, ease some of those trepidations that they might have?
I would say that sometimes people of that sort, like they feel like they have to have a problem to go to therapy. So I would say like, I would maybe ask them like, okay, well, what is your barrier to not really wanting to go? Like, if you have to have an issue, because I have friends like that. They're like, well, I don't want to go to therapy. I don't need it. I don't got a problem. And it's like, well, that's not really what it's about. Like, you don't have to have a problem to go to therapy. But I also would advocate for this. Therapy's not the only option. Like, if they want to get a life coach, that might be more so towards what they want to do. If they want to start off small and be like, hey, my therapist suggested this book, maybe you should read this book, and kind of like start small, because people get offended when you say, hey, you should see a therapist. Like, they feel like you're saying like, oh, you crazy, you need to see a therapist. Right? So I would say, depending on the person, take baby steps, because there's always more than one way to heal. And for some people, therapy is just not what they're going to do. And that's okay, right? But we just don't want to slander the name, because it's useful to everybody if you give it a chance.
Yes. And I 100% agree with you, but I do think that there is that stigma that, you know, if I go to therapy, then there's obviously something wrong with me, like you're broken. Therapy is for broken people, but I do agree with maintenance therapy, as some people might refer to it, just a regular check-in. So I want to ask you, you know, we're talking about people pleasing and those overly considerate behaviors in this, I don't even know what to call it, what we're in right now. Right. But in this very interesting time, we'll put it that way, where we're starting to have to kind of refigure out what it looks like to have social interactions and to be around people after we've spent so much time by ourselves or around fewer people. What do you say to those people who felt like, okay, I've done a lot of work, or I've made a lot of progress, or at least I did okay while I wasn't around people, and now I got to go back around people, and now I have to have these social interactions, and they might be having some anxieties around falling back into those same cycles? What is some advice that you can give to those people?
So usually when I work with clients like that, we kind of like do a fear ladder. So that just means like we kind of identify like what is the smallest thing that you could do and what's like the highest thing that you feel like is like so anxiety inducing, right? So we kind of name those things, and then we identify like, okay, how can you work on this today? So that means one of my clients has social anxiety, like, okay, let's go to Starbucks today and just like say hi to the barista and have like a small conversation. So it really just is kind of like rebuilding that tool. The way to like overcome anxiety is through it. Like, it's exposure therapy. You have to like expose yourself to it, because in your mind you're creating a scenario that is so bad and they're gonna hate me and this is gonna happen. And I will say 80% of the time that does not happen. Probably even a larger amount than that. But the way our brains work, it doesn't usually happen that way. So my advice typically is like, start small. Don't try to like push yourself, because if you push yourself into something you're not really like particularly ready for, it can go negatively. But if you start small and you start building your confidence around like, oh, I did that and it didn't go bad. Okay, cool. Then you'll have more confidence to keep building your way back up that ladder, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. So it basically start with coffee with a friend, work your way up to, you know, maybe dinner with a few people, and until you get back to the point where you're comfortable enough to, you know, have larger social gatherings, but taking baby steps.
Yeah, baby
is
steps
what you're saying.
Yeah, even if that means like I'm going to start just video chat and then go into person at some point, like just making sure that you're making steps forward. You're not just staying in the same step because like, oh, well.
Video chats work. I think I'm going to stay here.
Right. This is comfortable.
Yeah. And I wonder, because of we're kind of in this place where video chats have become the norm, whether we like it or not, is it something that a lot of us are going to get stuck in? For those of us who might be more introverted, or, you know, social settings might be a little more anxiety producing, like, is that a point where we might say, okay, I might need some extra help before I go out and do these things because I'm not really sure if I'm ready for it?
Yeah, I definitely think that. And I think with like the pandemic and everything happening with the variants, I can't blame my clients for being like, I'm not going. Like, I'm not going to push them to go there. I would say, okay, video chat is safe, but you do have to go out the house because, you know, you have to be outside. You have to like continue to live your life. So you might not even involve people. We might just say, okay, like, let's go to the gas station, use your wipes, put your gloves on, right? Or like, let's go to the grocery, like a small, like, you know, they have like food marts.
Right.
Yeah, like, let's go to the food mart, get the little tiny things you need, try there, and then come back. Like, we try to figure out small things, or go to the dog park where, you know, not a lot of people are there, or it's outside. Like,
outside,
I would just try to frame what my client needs around their personality, because I'm never just going to be like, well, this is part of therapy and you got to do it, so Like, no, I'm going to frame it around what's best for you and your personal preferences.
So guys, I want you to hear, I think that was very important because a lot of people struggle with therapy. They will go to one therapist and it won't work out well. And they'll say, well, I tried it and it didn't work. And so I'm never going back. But it is a personality match thing, I believe. I believe you have to find a therapist who works well with your personality. And so what Brea just said is really important because what she's saying is that her approach is going to be dependent on your personality and what's going to work for you and not a one size fits all thing. And I think that's how we get to a place where we start to understand and normalizing therapy when we understand that it is a relationship and not all relationships are going to go well. And when dating doesn't go well, we don't just throw the whole thing out the window. We try again with somebody else. And I think therapy should take a similar approach. Brea, would you agree?
I absolutely agree. I think that was well said, for sure. I've even had clients that, like, I encourage them, like, if you don't like something I'm doing or you're upset with the way something was said, like, this is a relationship. And relationships, they bend. No relationship is just straight. You know what I mean? If you have a conversation with a friend or someone and it just breaks, that relationship doesn't have a strong foundation in the first place, right? If it breaks that easily. So I encourage people to let their therapist or whomever know, like, hey, this doesn't work for me. Or when you said that, it kind of hurt my feelings. What did you mean by that? Because it helps my clients. It makes me feel so good because it makes me feel like, okay, if you do it with me, you're going to do that with other people. And
right.
I'm practice. So let's like take that to other people so you can feel empowered.
And that's awesome. Yeah. So I want to encourage you guys, listen, if you find yourself bending a little too much in the direction that makes other people happy, then people pleasing might be a struggle for you. And I want to thank Brea for breaking it down so wonderfully to helping us understand where it comes from so that we can understand that we're really going to have to do some internal work. We're going to have to dig deep, go back into childhood probably, and kind of reevaluate some things so that we can move forward. But that's okay. And that doesn't mean that we had bad childhoods. It just means that there were some things that kind of affected us and we're still carrying along with us into adulthood. So I want to encourage you to go and find a professional of some sort, preferably a therapist, but a professional of some sort to help you work through those things. Brea, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we go?
No, I appreciate you letting me come on and talk to your people. It's been a great experience.
Thank you so much. I have really enjoyed our conversation. It was very helpful to me, and I am sure that it will be helpful to everyone else who listens. Guys, this has been another episode of the Well Beauty Lab podcast. I am your Chief Wellness Officer, Lakeisha Enswa. We have just spoken to Ms. Brea Johnson, a licensed professional counselor. One more thing before we go, Brea, please tell everyone how they can get in contact with you.
You can follow me on Instagram because I don't answer DMs. I can't.
Right.
But you can get in contact with me on there. It's Therapy with Brea. So it's Therapy with _Brea, BRREEAA. And that's how you can view my page. I give some tips and things on there as well. And I do videos. So you can get a little bit of like, little tips to kind of like help with your anxiety or just, small little trinkets for you guys.
So if you are unsure if therapy is the right thing for you, Brea does share some wonderful tips on her Instagram page, and it might be helpful to you and give you just enough that you need to encourage you to go and find a therapist that works for you. So we'll make sure that we link to her Instagram page in the show notes so that you can follow and learn from Brea. So again, guys, this has been another episode of the Well Beauty Lab podcast, and I will talk to you again soon.
This has been another episode of Well Beauty Lab podcast. I am your host and Chief Wellness Officer, Lakeisha Enswa. Music and production provided by Creative Visionary